The rain hit the windshield so hard that Daniel Hartley could barely see the road in front of him. His phone rang again, the third time in 10 minutes, and he did not need to look at the screen to know who it was. The school. His daughter Mia had been sitting alone in the front office for almost an hour because there was no one to pick her up. His son Sam was somewhere on a bus that should have arrived home already, and Daniel had missed the stop time because a client meeting had run long. He gripped the wheel tighter and pressed his foot on the gas, ignoring the small voice in his head that told him to slow down. This was his life now. A single father with 2 children and a job that refused to wait for grief to pass. It had been 14 months since his wife Laura died, and every single day since then had felt like walking through fog with his hands out in front of him, hoping not to crash into something sharp. He pulled into the school parking lot, ran through the rain without an umbrella, and found Mia sitting on a bench near the front desk, her small legs swinging, her backpack twice the size of her body. She looked up at him with an expression that broke his heart every time he saw it. Not anger, not sadness. Just quiet acceptance, like she already expected to be forgotten. "I'm sorry, sweetheart," he said, kneeling down to her level. "Daddy's here now." "You're always sorry," she said softly, and those 4 words hit him harder than anything a grown adult had said to him in months. That night, after Sam finally made it home on the late bus, and both children were fed on cereal because Daniel had no energy left to cook, he sat at the kitchen table with his laptop open and a cup of coffee gone cold beside him. He typed the words into the search bar with shaking hands. "Nanny agency near me. Emergency childcare. Full-time nanny available immediately." He clicked on the first professional-looking website he found, a small local agency called Bright Futures Childcare. He filled out the form quickly, almost carelessly, because he was exhausted and desperate, and past the point of being careful. Under the section that asked what kind of person he was looking for, he typed only one sentence: "Someone who can show up and actually care." He hit submit and closed the laptop, not expecting much. He had tried 2 other agencies in the past year, and both times the nanny had quit within a month, unable to handle the quiet sadness that lived in every corner of his house. He assumed this would go the same way. The call came the next morning, faster than he expected. A woman from the agency, warm-voiced and professional, told him she had someone perfect, available immediately, excellent references, could start that same week if needed. "What's her name?" Daniel asked, only half paying attention, as he tied his tie with one hand and searched for his car keys with the other. "Claire Dawson," the woman said. "She's wonderful with children. I think you'll be very pleased." He barely wrote the name down. He barely read the 2-page file the agency emailed him that afternoon. He was juggling 3 deadlines at his engineering firm, a leaking pipe under the kitchen sink, and a phone call from Sam's teacher about missing homework. He did not have room in his head to research the woman who was about to walk into his home and his children's lives. He simply said yes, agreed on a start date, and moved on to the next crisis waiting for him. 3 days later, on a Tuesday morning that smelled like rain and fresh coffee, the doorbell rang at exactly 9 o'clock. Daniel opened the door still in his socks, his tie half done, a piece of toast hanging from his mouth. Standing on his porch was a young woman with light brown hair pulled back into a simple ponytail, wearing a plain gray coat and holding a small suitcase, like she wasn't entirely sure she was allowed to bring it inside. Her eyes were the kind of pale green that seemed to shift color depending on the light, and there was something in the way she stood, straight-backed but nervous, that made Daniel pause for just a moment longer than he meant to. "Mr. Hartley?" she asked. "I'm Claire, from the agency." "Right," he said, pulling the toast from his mouth, suddenly aware of how disheveled he must have looked. "Sorry, come in. It's a bit of a mess in here." "It's always a bit of a mess in here." Claire stepped inside and looked around the entryway, taking in the pile of shoes by the door, the crayon drawings taped crookedly to the wall, a single small shoe missing its pair sitting alone on the stairs. She did not seem bothered by any of it. If anything, something in her expression softened, as though the chaos of a real family home was comforting, rather than off-putting. "It's lovely," she said, and she meant it. Daniel gave her a quick, distracted tour of the house, rattling off schedules and allergies, and pickup times, as though reciting a grocery list, his mind already halfway out the door toward his car. He introduced her to Mia, who peeked out from behind the living room couch with wide, curious eyes, and to Sam, who barely looked up from his tablet before mumbling a quiet hello. "I have a meeting I cannot miss," Daniel said, checking his watch for the third time in 2 minutes. "Emergency numbers are on the fridge. My cell is on there too. If anything happens, anything at all, call me first." "We'll be fine," Claire said, and there was a steadiness in her voice that made him believe her, even though he barely knew her. He left without looking back, already composing an email in his head for the meeting he was late for. He did not notice the way Claire knelt down immediately to Mia's height and asked her, with real interest, what her favorite color was this week, as though she understood that a 6-year-old's favorite color could change daily, and that was worth asking about. He did not see her walk quietly over to Sam and simply sit near him without demanding conversation, letting the 9-year-old set the pace himself. He did not see any of it, because he was already gone, swallowed up by the demands of a life that had stopped making room for small, gentle moments a long time ago. By the time Daniel came home that evening, exhausted and irritable from a day that had gone sideways in every possible direction, he expected to find the usual scene: dishes in the sink, homework undone, children glued to screens because it was easier than fighting them for attention. Instead, he walked into a kitchen that smelled like something actually cooked, not microwaved. Mia was standing on a small step stool at the counter, carefully stirring a bowl of something with a wooden spoon almost as tall as she was, flour dusted across her cheek, and a smile on her face that Daniel had not seen in longer than he wanted to admit. Sam was at the table, homework spread out in front of him, actually working on it, occasionally glancing up to ask Claire a question that she answered patiently, without ever making him feel small for not knowing the answer already. Daniel stood in the doorway for a moment, unnoticed, just watching. It felt like looking through a window into someone else's life, a warmer one, a softer one. "Daddy!" Mia shouted when she finally spotted him, nearly knocking the bowl over in her excitement. "We made cookies! Claire showed me how to crack an egg without getting shell in it." "Did she now?" Daniel said, stepping into the kitchen, trying to keep his voice light even though something tight and unfamiliar had formed in his chest. Hope, maybe, or something close to it, a feeling he had not let himself have in a very long time. Claire looked up from the counter and gave him a small, polite smile. "I hope that's all right. I found some flour and sugar in the cupboard," and Mia seemed excited about the idea. "It's more than all right," Daniel said, and he meant it more than his tired voice probably let on. That first evening set a pattern that continued through the rest of the week. Claire arrived each morning exactly on time, dressed simply, always polite but never overly familiar. She learned the children's routines faster than any of the previous nannies had managed in a month. She knew, by day 3, that Mia needed her stuffed rabbit within arm's reach during nap time, and that Sam preferred to talk about his day only after he had eaten a snack, never before. She never asked Daniel for anything beyond what the job required. She never lingered in conversation longer than necessary. She kept a careful, respectful distance from him, as though she understood exactly where the line was drawn between employee and something else, and had no intention of crossing it. And yet, despite that distance, Daniel found himself noticing things about her. The way she paused sometimes when Mia mentioned her mother, a flicker of something crossing her face too quickly for him to name, the way she flinched, almost invisibly, when he mentioned his late wife's name during a rushed conversation about school forms. The way her eyes sometimes drifted to the photographs on the living room wall, particularly one of Laura holding baby Mia on the day she was born, and lingered there a beat too long before she caught herself and looked away. He told himself it was nothing. Grief made people sensitive to other people's grief, he reasoned. She was simply a compassionate person, doing a difficult job in a house still heavy with loss. That was all. But there was one afternoon, about 10 days into her employment, when Daniel came home early to grab a forgotten folder for a client meeting, and found Claire standing alone in the hallway outside his bedroom, looking at a framed photograph of Laura that hung there. She did not hear him come in. For a long moment, she simply stood there, her hand raised slightly as though she wanted to touch the glass but stopped herself, her expression unreadable, somewhere between sadness and something that looked almost like guilt. "Claire?" Daniel said, and she startled so badly she nearly knocked the frame off the wall. "I'm sorry," she said quickly, straightening it, her cheeks flushing pink. "I was just, the children mentioned their mother, and I saw the photograph. and I didn't mean to intrude." "It's fine," Daniel said, though something in him wondered why a simple photograph had affected her so deeply. "That's Laura, my wife. She passed away a little over a year ago." "I know," Claire said, and then, as though realizing what she had just admitted, added quickly, "I mean, the agency mentioned it in your file. I'm very sorry for your loss." Daniel nodded, accepting the explanation without question, too tired and too busy to notice the strange catch in her voice, the way her hands trembled slightly as she smoothed down her coat. He grabbed his folder and left for his meeting, already forgetting the moment as quickly as it had happened, filing it away as nothing more than an oddly emotional afternoon in a house that saw plenty of those. He had no idea that the woman he had hired to care for his children, in a moment of pure desperation, was not, in fact, a stranger to his family at all. He had no idea that somewhere in her small suitcase, tucked carefully between folded sweaters, was an old photograph of her own, one that matched, almost perfectly, the photograph hanging on his hallway wall. He had no idea that Claire Dawson had not found this job by chance, that she had searched for it, waited for it, needed it, in a way that went far deeper than employment. He simply closed the front door behind him, checked his watch, and drove off to his meeting, completely unaware that his life, and everything he thought he understood about his past, was about to change in ways he could never have predicted. Inside the house, Claire stood alone in the quiet hallway for a long moment after he left, staring at the photograph of the woman she had once known so well, the woman whose memory had brought her here in the first place. She pressed her hand gently against her chest, took a slow breath, and whispered something so quiet that even the empty hallway barely caught the words. "I found them, Laura," she said. "I finally found them." Then she turned, wiped her eyes quickly with the back of her hand, and walked back toward the kitchen where Mia was waiting to show her a drawing, because whatever secrets she carried, whatever truth she had not yet found the courage to share, the children needed her now, and for the moment, that was enough. The days turned into weeks, and Claire Dawson became something the Hartley household had not had in a very long time: consistency. Every morning she arrived at exactly 9 o'clock, rain or shine, her simple gray coat traded eventually for a lighter jacket as the weather warmed. Every afternoon she picked up Mia from kindergarten and met Sam at the bus stop, walking them both home with stories about her day that made even the most boring errands sound like small adventures. Mia adored her almost instantly, the way small children often attach themselves fully and without hesitation to anyone who treats them with real attention. She followed Claire from room to room, chattering about everything from her favorite cartoon characters to the exact shade of blue she wanted her bedroom painted someday. Claire never seemed to tire of it. She listened the way very few adults listen to children, with her full attention, asking follow-up questions that showed she had actually been paying attention, rather than simply waiting for her turn to speak. Sam was harder to win over, as 9-year-old boys often are, especially ones who had learned early that people sometimes leave. He kept his distance at first, answering Claire's questions with short, guarded responses, testing her the way children test adults they are not sure they can trust. But Claire never pushed. She never demanded he open up before he was ready. She simply showed up, day after day, steady and reliable, until one afternoon, without any dramatic moment or turning point, Sam simply started talking to her, the way he might talk to an older sister, telling her about the boy at school who kept taking his pencils, about the video game level he could not beat, about the strange dream he had the night before that he could not quite explain. Daniel noticed the change in his son before he consciously registered why it was happening. Sam smiled more. He came home from school and actually wanted to talk about his day, instead of retreating immediately to his room. He stopped flinching every time an adult raised their voice even slightly, a habit he had developed in the months after Laura's death that had quietly broken Daniel's heart every single time he witnessed it. Mia, too, seemed lighter somehow. She stopped asking, every single night at bedtime, if Daniel was going to disappear the way her mother had. She started sleeping through the night again, something she had not consistently done in over a year. Daniel told himself it was simply the natural result of having reliable, competent childcare after months of chaos and constant turnover. But somewhere underneath that reasonable explanation, he knew it was more than that. It was Claire specifically. Something about the calm, steady warmth she brought into every room she entered. Something about the way she seemed to understand, without being told, exactly what his children needed in any given moment. He began, without quite meaning to, looking forward to coming home. It started small. He would find himself checking the clock at work, counting down the hours until he could leave, not because he was eager to escape his job, but because he was eager to walk through his own front door and see what new small miracle Claire had worked that day. A garden Mia had helped plant along the side of the house, a book report Sam had actually finished early, sitting proudly on the kitchen table waiting to be admired, a dinner that was actually a full meal rather than something reheated in a hurry. He started staying in the kitchen a little longer in the evenings after Claire finished her shift, lingering over a cup of tea, asking about her day in a way that went beyond simple politeness. She always answered warmly but briefly, redirecting the conversation gently back to the children, back to practical matters, as though she were carefully, deliberately keeping a wall up between them. He noticed the wall. He respected it, mostly, understanding that she was his employee and that professional boundaries existed for good reason. But there were moments, small unguarded ones, when the wall seemed to slip. One evening, about 3 weeks into her employment, Daniel came home to find Claire sitting on the living room floor with Mia, both of them surrounded by old photo albums that Daniel had not looked through in over a year, boxes he had shoved into a closet after Laura's death because looking at them had simply hurt too much. Mia wanted to see pictures of her mother, Claire explained quickly, seeing the look on Daniel's face. I hope that's all right. I found the boxes in the hall closet. I should have asked first. No, it's fine, Daniel said, though his voice was tighter than he intended. He sat down on the couch, watching as Mia pointed excitedly at a photograph of Laura, laughing on a beach somewhere, her hair whipped sideways by the wind, her smile wide and unguarded. She was beautiful, Claire said quietly, almost to herself, her fingers tracing the edge of the photograph without quite touching it. She was, Daniel agreed, surprised at how easily the words came out. He had not talked about Laura, really talked about her, with anyone in months. Grief counselors had tried. His sister had tried. Friends had tried and eventually given up when he kept deflecting every conversation back to safer, shallower topics. But something about the quiet, unhurried way Claire sat with the memory, not rushing him, not offering empty comfort, made it easier to simply exist in the moment without needing to protect himself from it. What was she like? Claire asked, and there was something in her voice, a careful gentleness that suggested she already had some idea of the answer, and was asking anyway, testing whether he would tell the truth, or the polished version people usually gave. Daniel found himself talking, slowly at first and then more freely, about Laura's terrible sense of direction, and her incredible sense of humor, about the way she used to sing off-key in the car, with the windows down regardless of who might hear, about the small, stubborn kindness that had defined nearly everything she did. Mia listened, wide-eyed, soaking in details about her mother that she was too young to remember on her own. Claire listened too, and more than once, Daniel caught her blinking rapidly, as though holding back tears for a woman she had never claimed to know. He noticed it. He filed it away in the back of his mind, a small, strange detail among many small, strange details he had begun collecting about Claire Dawson, without quite realizing he was building toward a bigger picture. There was the way she sometimes hummed a tune while doing dishes, a tune that sounded oddly familiar, though Daniel could not place where he had heard it before. There was the fact that she seemed to know, without ever being told, that Mia was allergic to a specific brand of laundry detergent, information that was not in the file the agency had sent him. There was a single moment, weeks earlier, when Sam had mentioned offhand that his mother used to call him her little explorer, and Claire's face had gone pale for just a second before she recovered and changed the subject. Small things, odd things. Things that, on their own, meant nothing at all, but together, were beginning to form a shape Daniel could not quite see clearly yet, like a photograph slowly developing in a dark room, details emerging one at a time, from what had originally looked like nothing but shadow. One Friday evening, after the children were asleep, Daniel found himself standing in the kitchen doorway, watching Claire finish wiping down the counters, her movements efficient and practiced after weeks of routine. She was humming that same tune again, quiet and almost unconscious, and this time, Daniel finally placed it. It was a song Laura used to sing to Sam when he was a baby, an old lullaby that Daniel had not heard in years, one that had never been recorded or written down anywhere he knew of. Something Laura had learned from her own mother and passed down informally, privately, within the small closed circle of their family. "Where did you learn that song?" he asked, his voice sharper than he intended, cutting through the quiet kitchen like a blade. Claire froze, the dish towel still in her hands, her back to him for a long moment before she turned around slowly, and for the first time since she had arrived in his home, Daniel saw something in her expression he had not seen before. Fear, mixed with something that looked almost like relief, as though a secret she had been carrying for a long time was finally, unavoidably, about to come out into the light. "Daniel," she said quietly, using his first name for the first time since she had started working for him, "I think we need to talk." The kitchen went silent, except for the low hum of the refrigerator and the distant ticking of the clock in the hallway. Daniel stood in the doorway, his heart suddenly pounding in a way that had nothing to do with anger, and everything to do with a fear he could not yet name. Claire set the dish towel down slowly, deliberately, buying herself a few seconds before she had to speak. "That song," Daniel said again, quieter this time. "Where did you learn it, Claire? It's not something you can just find online. It's not something anyone outside my family would know." Claire took a breath, and when she finally spoke, her voice trembled slightly, though she kept her eyes steady on his. "I need you to know that I never meant to hide anything from you in a way that was cruel. I want you to understand that first, before I explain, because I know how this is going to sound." "Explain what?" Daniel asked, crossing his arms, though the gesture was more about holding himself together than any real hostility. "Laura was my cousin," Claire said. The words landed in the room like something physical, something with weight. Daniel felt the floor tilt slightly beneath him, and he reached out, almost without thinking, to steady himself against the counter. "What?" he said, though he had heard her perfectly well. It was simply too large a piece of information to process in a single breath. "Not first cousins," Claire continued quickly, as though rushing through the explanation would somehow make it easier to hear. "Second cousins, on her mother's side. We grew up in different cities, so we weren't close the way some cousins are, but we spent almost every summer together as children at our grandmother's house in Millbrook. Laura taught me that lullaby when I was maybe 8 years old. She used to sing it to her dolls, and then later, I imagine, to her own children." Daniel stared at her, 100 questions crowding his mind at once, none of them quite forming into words fast enough to speak. "Laura never mentioned a cousin named Claire," he finally managed. "In 11 years of marriage, she never once mentioned you." Claire's expression flickered with something that looked like old, familiar pain. "We had a falling out," she said quietly. "Our families did, more specifically. It happened when I was around 16, over something that honestly seems small now. An inheritance dispute involving our grandmother's house after she passed away. My parents said things they shouldn't have said. Laura's mother said things back. It turned ugly, and it turned permanent, the way family disputes sometimes do. Laura and I lost touch completely after that. I tried writing to her a few times in my 20s, but the letters either never reached her, or she chose not to respond, and eventually I stopped trying, assuming she had moved on, and wanted nothing more to do with that side of the family." "So how did you end up here?" Daniel asked, his voice hardening slightly now, the initial shock giving way to something closer to suspicion. "In my house, taking care of my children. That's not a coincidence, Claire. That can't be a coincidence." Claire's hands twisted together in front of her, and for a moment, she looked younger than her years, uncertain in a way that contradicted the calm, capable woman Daniel had come to know over the past several weeks. "It wasn't entirely a coincidence," she admitted, "but it also wasn't planned the way you might be imagining right now. Please, let me explain properly." Daniel gestured toward the kitchen table, and they both sat down, the space between them suddenly feeling much larger than the small distance across the wooden surface. "About a year and a half ago," Claire began, "I saw an obituary online. I still don't fully know how I found it, some strange algorithm or shared connection through an old family friend. I'm honestly not certain. But I saw Laura's name, and her photograph, and I realized she had passed away. I was devastated in a way that surprised me, considering how long we had been out of contact. I think some part of me had always believed that someday, when we were both older, when the old family arguments had faded enough not to matter anymore, we would find our way back to each other. Her death took that possibility away, before I ever had the chance to try." Daniel listened, his anger slowly softening into something more complicated, though he remained guarded, unsure yet whether to fully believe her. I saw the obituary mention 2 children, Claire continued, her voice growing steadier now that the truth was finally out in the open. A boy and a girl, and a husband. I thought about reaching out then, sending a card, attending a memorial service if there was one I could find information about. But by the time I found the obituary, months had already passed since her death, and I felt like an intruder, showing up as a near stranger, to grieve alongside people who had actually known her every day. So instead you became our nanny, Daniel said, his tone flat, still working to understand the logic of it. That wasn't the original plan, Claire said quickly. I promise you that. I moved to this city about 8 months ago for an unrelated job opportunity, one that fell through almost immediately after I arrived. I needed work, and I have always loved children. I have a background in early childhood education, so I registered with a few local agencies. When Bright Futures called me about a position with a family named Hartley, 2 children named Sam and Mia, I nearly dropped the phone. I asked more questions than I probably should have, trying to confirm it was really you, really your family, and when I realized it was, I couldn't say no. I told myself I simply wanted to know that Laura's children were being cared for, that they were safe and loved. I told myself I would take the position, make sure everything was all right, and if it ever became too complicated, I would quietly step away. And instead you stayed, Daniel said, for weeks, without ever telling me the truth. I know, Claire said, and for the first time, her composure cracked slightly. Her eyes filling with tears, she quickly blinked back. Every single day, I told myself I would explain it to you, and every single day, I found a reason to wait a little longer. At first, it was because I was afraid you would fire me on the spot, assume I had some ulterior motive, and I couldn't stand the thought of leaving Sam and Mia so suddenly, after they had already lost so much. Then, as the weeks went on, it became harder for a different reason entirely. I started to care about this family, Daniel. Not out of obligation to Laura's memory, but for its own sake. I started to care about you and the children as people, not as a connection to my cousin, and I was terrified that once you knew the truth, you would only ever see me as an extension of her, or worse, as someone who had lied her way into your home. Daniel sat in silence for a long moment, processing everything she had said, turning it over in his mind from every angle he could manage. Part of him wanted to be furious, wanted to feel betrayed and deceived in the way that seemed reasonable given the circumstances. But another part of him, a quieter and more honest part, recognized something true and unguarded in the way Claire had finally spoken, something that did not feel like manipulation or calculation. You should have told me, he finally said. The moment you realized who I was, who the children were, you should have told me the truth. You're right, Claire said softly. I know you're right. I have no excuse that makes it acceptable. Only explanations that might help you understand why I made the choices I made. I was scared, Daniel. Scared of losing something I had only just found. Losing what exactly? Daniel asked. Claire looked up at him, her pale green eyes steady, despite the tears still threatening at their edges. A connection to Laura, she said. And somewhere along the way, without meaning for it to happen, a connection to all of you. The refrigerator hummed. The clock in the hallway ticked. Upstairs, faintly, Daniel could hear the creak of old floorboards as one of the children shifted in their sleep, blissfully unaware that the foundation of their small, carefully rebuilt world had just quietly cracked. I need time to think about this, Daniel finally said, standing up from the table, his voice heavy with exhaustion rather than anger now. I understand, Claire said, standing as well, gathering her coat from the back of the chair with trembling hands. I'll go home for tonight. If you want me to continue working here, I will. If you don't, I understand that too, and I won't make it difficult for you. But Daniel, please know that nothing I felt for those children, nothing I feel for this family, has ever been anything less than completely genuine. She left quietly through the front door, and Daniel stood alone in his kitchen for a long time afterward, staring at the space where she had been sitting, trying to reconcile the woman he had come to trust over the past several weeks with the secret she had just revealed, unsure, for the first time since she had arrived, what tomorrow was going to look like. Daniel did not sleep that night. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling, replaying the conversation over and over, examining it from every possible angle, the way an engineer might examine a structural flaw, searching for the exact point where everything had gone wrong. By the time morning light crept through the curtains, he had reached no clear conclusion, only a tangled mess of feelings that refused to sort themselves into anything simple. He got the children ready for school himself, fumbling through the morning routine that Claire had made look effortless, burning the toast, and forgetting Mia's water bottle until they were already halfway to the car. Sam noticed immediately that something was different. "Where's Claire?" he asked from the back seat, his voice carrying a note of worry that Daniel recognized instantly, the particular anxious tone of a child who had already learned that people could disappear without warning. "She's taking a couple of days off," Daniel said, keeping his voice as light as he could manage. "I'll be picking you up after school instead." Sam did not respond, but Daniel caught his son's reflection in the rearview mirror, his small face pinched with worry, and something in Daniel's chest twisted painfully. He had not fully understood, until that moment, how deeply his children had already come to rely on Claire's presence, how much stability she had quietly built into their fragile, rebuilt lives in just a few short weeks. Mia was more direct about it. "Is Claire coming back?" she asked at breakfast, her small hands wrapped around a glass of orange juice she was not drinking. "She said she would help me with my reading tonight." "I don't know yet, sweetheart," Daniel admitted, unable to give her a false promise he was not certain he could keep. He went to work that day, but accomplished almost nothing, staring at his computer screen for long stretches without seeing what was on it. His colleague and old friend, Nathaniel Bishop, stopped by his office around midday, noticing immediately that something was wrong. "You look like you haven't slept," Nathaniel said, closing the office door behind him and sitting down uninvited in the chair across from Daniel's desk. "I haven't," Daniel admitted, and then, because Nathaniel was one of the few people he still trusted enough to be honest with, he explained the entire situation, the lullaby, the confession, the tangled family history that connected Claire to Laura in a way he never could have anticipated. Nathaniel listened without interrupting, his expression thoughtful throughout the whole story. When Daniel finished, he leaned back in his chair and was quiet for a long moment before speaking. "So let me understand this correctly," Nathaniel said. "This woman found out your kids existed, took a job in your house without telling you who she really was, and has spent the last several weeks becoming an essential part of your family's life. And you're upset because she didn't lead with all of that information on day one, when she barely knew you, and had every reason to assume you'd slam the door in her face. When you put it that way, it sounds like I'm the unreasonable one," Daniel said, rubbing his eyes with the heel of his hand. "I'm not saying she handled it perfectly," Nathaniel said. "She should have told you sooner, probably. But Daniel, think about what she actually did. She grieved for a cousin she'd lost touch with. She found a way to be close to that memory by caring for the children that cousin left behind. And by every account you've given me, she did that job well, really well, better than anyone else you've hired in the past year, if I'm remembering correctly." Daniel did not respond immediately, turning the words over in his mind, weighing them against the hurt and confusion still sitting heavy in his chest. "The question isn't really whether she lied to you," Nathaniel continued, more gently now. "The question is why the lie is bothering you as much as it clearly is. And I think, if you're honest with yourself, it's not really about the lie at all." "Then what is it about?" Daniel asked, though some part of him already suspected the answer. "I think you're scared," Nathaniel said simply. "Because somewhere over the past few weeks, you started caring about this woman in a way that has nothing to do with your children's schedule or your grocery list, and that scares you more than any secret about a family lullaby ever could." Daniel did not answer that. He didn't need to. The truth of it sat in his chest like a stone, undeniable once someone else had finally said it out loud. He left work early that afternoon, unable to focus on anything productive, and picked the children up himself again, watching them both grow quieter and more subdued as the hours passed without any word from Claire. That evening, after a dinner that felt hollow compared to the warm, lively meals of the past several weeks, Mia climbed into his lap on the couch, her small face troubled in a way that 6-year-olds should not have to carry. "Daddy," she said quietly, "did Claire leave because of me? Did I do something bad?" "No, sweetheart," Daniel said immediately, pulling her closer, his heart aching at the thought that his daughter might be blaming herself for something entirely outside her control. You didn't do anything wrong at all. This is between me and Claire, and it has nothing to do with you or your brother. But you're sad, Mia said, with the uncomfortable perceptiveness that children sometimes have, seeing straight through the careful composure adults try to maintain. And Sam's sad too, and I'm sad. Everybody's sad again, like before. Like before. The words landed with particular weight, and Daniel understood exactly what she meant. Before Claire arrived, the house had settled into a kind of low, constant grief, a background hum of sadness that had become so familiar it almost felt normal. In just a few short weeks, Claire had changed that entirely, had brought light back into rooms that had grown dim, had given his children something to smile about that had nothing to do with forced cheerfulness or well-meaning distraction. And now, because of his own uncertainty, his own inability to process what he had learned, that light was flickering out again. He thought about Laura that night, more clearly than he had allowed himself to in months. He thought about her sense of humor, her fierce loyalty to the people she loved, the way she had always believed that family, even complicated and imperfect family, was worth fighting for. He wondered what she would think of the situation unfolding in her own home, her own children caught in the middle of a secret rooted in her own memory. He thought, too, about the falling out Claire had described, the inheritance dispute, the harsh words exchanged between families that had never been resolved. He remembered, with a jolt, a conversation he'd had with Laura early in their marriage, a rare and brief mention of a cousin she had once been close to as a child, a friendship lost to some old family conflict she never fully explained and clearly did not want to discuss. At the time, he had not pressed the issue, respecting her reluctance to revisit painful history. Now, sitting alone in his quiet living room, he wondered if that half-remembered conversation had been about Claire all along. He picked up his phone and scrolled to the number the agency had provided, Claire's personal cell phone, a number he had never actually used because all their previous communication had happened in person. His thumb hovered over the call button for a long moment before he finally pressed it, his heart pounding as the phone rang once, twice, 3 times. "Daniel?" Claire's voice answered, cautious and uncertain, as though she had been waiting anxiously for this call while also dreading it. "I think we need to talk again," Daniel said. "Properly this time. Would you be willing to come by tomorrow, after the kids are at school, just to talk? No decisions yet, just talk." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and Daniel could hear the quiet exhale of relief before Claire spoke again. "Yes," she said. "Of course. I'll be there." He hung up the phone and sat alone in the darkening living room for a long time afterward, staring at the photograph of Laura on the wall, wondering what secrets and connections still lay hidden beneath the surface of his ordinary, upturned life, and whether he was truly ready to uncover all of them. Claire arrived at exactly 9 the next morning, the same time she had always arrived for work, though this time, she stood on the porch with none of her usual confidence, her hands twisting together in front of her, her eyes searching Daniel's face for some sign of what to expect. "Come in," Daniel said, stepping aside to let her through the door. They sat in the living room this time, not the kitchen, the space between them on the couch, smaller than the distance across the kitchen table had been, though the tension in the air remained just as heavy. Daniel had made coffee, an unconscious gesture of hospitality that surprised even himself, and he pushed a cup toward her before settling into the armchair across from her. "I want to know everything," he said. "Not just the parts you think will make me less angry. Everything. Starting with why the falling out between your families happened in the first place." Claire nodded, wrapping her hands around the warm mug, as though drawing strength from it. "My grandmother, Eleanor, owned a house in Millbrook, the one I mentioned, where Laura and I spent our summers as children. When she passed away, there was a disagreement about the property. My father believed he was entitled to a larger share because he had helped care for her in her final years. Laura's mother, my Aunt Margaret, believed the house should be divided equally among all the grandchildren, since that was what Eleanor's will actually specified. It should have been a simple legal matter, but it turned personal very quickly. Things were said that couldn't be unsaid. My father accused Margaret of manipulating Eleanor in her final months. Margaret accused my father of caring more about money than family. By the time the estate was finally settled, months later, both sides had drawn lines that never really softened again. And you and Laura were caught in the middle," Daniel said. "We were 16 and 17, Claire said. Old enough to understand what was happening, too young to have any real power to stop it. We tried, for a little while, to stay in touch on our own, separate from our parents' argument. We wrote letters. We talked on the phone a few times. But eventually the distance and the awkwardness of it wore us down, and life moved forward the way it does, and we simply drifted apart, without ever meaning for it to become permanent. Daniel absorbed this, filling in a gap in Laura's history that he had never fully understood, a quiet sadness she had carried, that he had sensed but never pushed her to explain. When I found her obituary, Claire continued, and read that she had passed away, I felt like I had lost the chance to ever make things right between us, not because of anything either of us had personally done wrong, but because of an old argument that was never really ours to begin with. I grieved for her, and I grieved for the friendship we never got to rebuild, and when the opportunity came to care for her children, even under circumstances I handled poorly, I felt like I was being given a chance to make something right, even if it was too late to fix things with Laura herself. You could have simply told me who you were from the start, Daniel said, though his voice had lost most of its earlier edge. I would have understood, Claire. Maybe not immediately, but eventually. What made you so certain I would react badly? Claire was quiet for a moment, considering the question carefully before answering. Grief makes people protective, she finally said. I've seen it happen in other families. A stranger showing up claiming a connection to a lost loved one can feel like an intrusion, even when the intentions are good. I was afraid you would see me as someone trying to insert myself into your family's story, for reasons that had nothing to do with genuinely caring about Sam and Mia. And the longer I waited to tell you, the harder it became, because every day that passed made the omission feel bigger and harder to explain. Daniel nodded slowly, understanding the logic, even if he still wished she had chosen differently. The children have been asking about you, he said. Constantly. Mia thinks she did something wrong. Sam has barely spoken since you left. Claire's eyes filled with tears immediately, her composure slipping in a way it had not during the entire rest of the conversation. That's the part that's been unbearable, she said. Knowing they're hurting, because of a situation that has nothing to do with them, a situation created entirely by adults and old family disputes they know nothing about. Daniel, whatever you decide about me, please don't let them believe, for even a moment, that any of this is their fault. I've told them that, Daniel said. Repeatedly, but children believe what they feel more than what they're told, and right now what they're feeling is that someone they trusted disappeared without explanation. The words landed harder than Daniel perhaps intended, and Claire flinched visibly, absorbing the weight of them without argument. I know I don't deserve to simply pick back up where we left off, she said quietly. If you decide this arrangement can't continue, I will respect that completely, and I will make sure to say goodbye to the children properly, in a way that doesn't leave them wondering or blaming themselves. That's the very least I owe them, and you. Daniel sat in silence for a long moment, studying the woman across from him, searching for any trace of the manipulation or ulterior motive that his initial anger had wanted so badly to find. He found none. What he found instead was someone who had made a mistake, born out of grief and fear rather than deception, someone who had, in the process of trying to hold on to a lost connection to her cousin, accidentally built something real and valuable with the family that cousin had left behind. I'm not ready to make a final decision today, Daniel admitted, but I also don't want you to simply disappear from their lives while I figure things out. Would you be willing to continue working here, at least for now, while we both take time to sort through everything else? Relief flooded Claire's face, quickly followed by careful restraint, as though she did not want to seem too eager or too presumptuous. Yes, she said. Of course. Thank you, Daniel. I promise I'll respect whatever boundaries you need. There's one more thing, Daniel said, and something in his tone made Claire go still. I want to see whatever you have. Photographs, letters, anything from those summers with Laura. I think it would help me understand her a little better. There's so much I never knew, apparently. Claire nodded, reaching into her bag and pulling out a small, worn photograph she had clearly been carrying with her, the one Daniel did not yet know she had brought specifically for this conversation, tucked carefully in an inside pocket like a piece of evidence she had been waiting for the right moment to present. She handed it to him gently. It showed two young girls, maybe 12 and 13 years old, standing in front of an old white farmhouse, both grinning widely, arms slung around each other's shoulders, sunlight catching in their hair. Daniel recognized Laura immediately despite her youth, the same wide smile she had carried into adulthood, the same mischievous glint in her eyes. Beside her stood a younger version of Claire, gap-toothed and freckled, looking at her cousin with obvious adoration. "That was the summer we decided to build a treehouse," Claire said, a small, genuine smile breaking through her earlier nervousness. "It was a disaster. We used the wrong kind of nails, and the whole thing collapsed within a week." Laura laughed so hard she cried. She always laughed like that, like the whole world was funnier than anyone else realized. Daniel stared at the photograph for a long time, tracing his thumb gently over the edge of it, seeing pieces of his wife he had never known existed, a childhood joy, captured decades before he had ever met her. "Thank you for showing me this," he said quietly, and for the first time since the confession in the kitchen, something between them shifted, not back to where it had been before, but toward something new, something built on honesty, rather than assumption. "I have more," Claire said softly, "whenever you're ready to see them." Daniel nodded, handing the photograph back carefully, though some part of him already hoped there would be many more evenings like this one, evenings spent uncovering pieces of a past he thought he had fully known, guided by a woman who was slowly, carefully, becoming something far more important to his family than he had ever anticipated when he first typed those desperate words into a search engine weeks earlier. Claire returned to work the next morning, and the reunion with the children was every bit as emotional as Daniel had expected. Mia burst into tears the moment she saw Claire standing in the doorway, running across the living room, and wrapping her small arms around Claire's legs with a force that nearly knocked them both over. Sam, trying to maintain his 9-year-old composure, hung back for only a moment before he too crossed the room, allowing Claire to pull him into a hug he would have normally considered too babyish to accept. "I missed you both so much," Claire said, kneeling down to embrace them properly, her own eyes wet with tears she made no attempt to hide. "Are you staying?" Mia asked, pulling back just enough to look up at Claire's face, searching for reassurance. "For real this time? Forever?" Claire glanced up at Daniel, who stood in the doorway watching the reunion, with an expression that had softened considerably over the past 2 days. "I'm staying for now," Claire said carefully, unwilling to make promises that were not entirely hers to make, "and I'm very happy to be back." That evening, once the children were settled and occupied with a movie in the living room, Daniel found himself once again sitting across from Claire at the kitchen table, though this time the atmosphere felt entirely different, lighter somehow, though still carrying an undercurrent of things unresolved. "Can I ask you something?" Daniel said, turning his coffee cup slowly between his hands. "Of course," Claire said. "Why early childhood education?" he asked. "You mentioned before that you have a background in it. Was that always what you wanted to do?" Claire smiled, a genuine, easy smile that Daniel realized he had rarely seen from her until recently, now that the weight of her secret had finally lifted. "I think, in a strange way, it started with those summers with Laura," she said. "I was an only child, and my parents worked long hours, and those weeks at my grandmother's house with Laura were some of the only times I really got to experience what it felt like to have a sibling, someone to build things with, and get into trouble with, and laugh with, until it hurt. When that connection was taken away, I think some part of me spent the rest of my life trying to recreate that feeling for other children, trying to give them the kind of joyful, present childhood that I only got to experience in small, scattered pieces." Daniel considered this, understanding a little better now the deep well of genuine care Claire brought to her work, a care that went far beyond simple job performance. "Laura would have loved watching you with the kids," Daniel said, the words surprising him even as he spoke them, though he found he meant every word. "She had that same way about her, that same patience with them, even when they were being difficult. I used to tease her that she was more fun than I was, that the kids always wanted her over me, whenever there was a choice to be made." "I doubt that's entirely true," Claire said gently. "It absolutely was," Daniel said, a small, rueful laugh escaping him, the first genuine laugh Claire had heard from him in the weeks she had known him. "I was always the one worried about schedules and homework and bedtime routines. Laura was the one who let them stay up too late building blanket forts in the living room, who let them eat ice cream for breakfast on Saturdays as a special treat, who somehow made every ordinary day feel a little bit magical. And now you're both, Claire said quietly, the schedule keeper and the magic maker. That's not an easy thing to become all at once. Daniel looked up at her, struck by how accurately she had captured the impossible balancing act he had been failing at for the past 14 months. I don't think I've done a very good job of the magic part, he admitted. Not until you arrived, honestly. Claire's cheeks flushed slightly at the compliment, and she looked down at her own coffee cup, clearly unsure how to respond to the warmth in his voice. You're doing better than you think, she said finally. Grief takes time. There's no schedule for it, no matter how much you might want one. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the kind of silence that no longer felt strained the way it had just days earlier, before Daniel spoke again, his voice more hesitant this time. I keep thinking about something you said. That you cared about this family. Not just because of Laura, but for its own sake. I believe you, Claire. I want you to know that. And I think some part of me has started caring about you in a way that goes beyond simply being grateful for the help around the house. Claire looked up sharply, her eyes wide with surprise, though not, Daniel noted carefully, with rejection. Daniel, she said softly, I think I need to be honest with you about something else, something I haven't said out loud yet, even to myself. What is it? He asked, his heart suddenly beating faster. I've felt the same way for weeks, Claire admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. I've tried very hard not to, because it felt inappropriate, given the circumstances, given that I work for you, given the complicated connection to Laura that already made everything feel so tangled. But I can't keep pretending it isn't there. The confession hung in the air between them, delicate and uncertain, neither of them quite sure what to do with it, now that it had finally been spoken aloud. Daniel felt something loosen in his chest, a tightness he had been carrying for so long, he had almost forgotten what it felt like to breathe without it. I think we need to be careful, Daniel said slowly, though there was no rejection in his tone, only caution. Not because of what either of us feels, but because of the children, because of Laura's memory, because this is complicated in ways that most relationships simply aren't. I agree completely, Claire said, nodding. I don't want to rush anything, Daniel. I don't want the children to feel confused or unsettled by something they're not ready to understand. And I don't want either of us to make a decision out of grief or loneliness that we later regret. Then we take it slowly, Daniel said. Whatever this is, we figure it out slowly and honestly, without any more secrets between us. No more secrets, Claire agreed, and there was a quiet solemnity to the promise, as though they were both aware of how much that particular assurance mattered, given everything that had already happened between them. They did not kiss that night, did not do anything more than sit together in the quiet kitchen, talking softly about small things, until the movie in the living room ended, and the children came looking for their bedtime routine. But something had shifted permanently between them. An understanding reached. A door opened that neither of them fully knew how to walk through yet, but that both of them, for the first time in a very long time, felt genuinely hopeful about. As Claire gathered her things to leave that evening, Daniel walked her to the door, the two of them lingering there longer than strictly necessary. Thank you, Daniel said, for being honest with me, finally. Thank you for giving me a second chance to be, Claire replied, and then, with a small, warm smile, she stepped out into the evening air, leaving Daniel standing in his doorway, watching her go, feeling, for the first time since Laura's death, that the future ahead of him might hold more than simply surviving one difficult day after another. 3 weeks passed, and life in the Hartley household settled into a rhythm that felt, for the first time in a very long while, genuinely peaceful. Claire and Daniel had not rushed anything, exactly as they promised each other they would not, but small gestures had crept naturally into their days. A hand brushing against another while passing dishes across the kitchen counter. A lingering glance held a beat too long. A quiet dinner shared after the children were asleep. Candlelight replaced by the simple glow of the kitchen light. Conversation flowing easily between them, in a way that no longer required careful navigation around old secrets. The children had noticed the shift too, though neither Daniel nor Claire had explained anything directly to them yet. Mia had started drawing pictures of the four of them together, family portraits with stick figure versions of herself. Sam, Daniel, and Claire, standing in a row in front of a crayon house, the sun always shining brightly overhead in every version. Sam, more perceptive than his sister in some ways, had simply started referring to Claire during conversations with his friends as our Claire, a small but significant shift in language that Daniel overheard one afternoon and felt his chest tighten with something between joy and nervous anticipation. It was on a Sunday afternoon, 3 weeks into this new careful happiness, that everything became complicated again. Daniel had suggested, gently, that it might be time for Claire to reconnect with her Aunt Margaret, Laura's mother, given everything that had happened. He reasoned that Margaret deserved to know that her granddaughter and grandson had, quite unexpectedly, found their way back to a piece of family she had lost touch with years earlier. Claire had been nervous about the idea, but ultimately agreed, understanding that continuing to keep her aunt in the dark felt wrong now that so much else had come out into the open. The phone call had not gone well. Margaret's voice, when Claire finally worked up the courage to call, had been cold and clipped from the very first hello, the years of estrangement audible in every carefully chosen word. When Claire explained the situation, carefully leaving out the growing romantic connection between herself and Daniel for the moment, focusing instead on simply reconnecting as family, Margaret's response had been sharp and unforgiving. "After everything your father put this family through," Margaret said, her voice tight with old, unresolved anger, "you think you can just walk into Laura's home and take her place with her children? Do you have any idea how that looks, Claire? How it feels?" "That's not what I'm trying to do," Claire had said, her voice trembling slightly as she stood in her small apartment, phone pressed hard against her ear. "I would never try to take Laura's place. I loved her too, Aunt Margaret. I've always loved her, even after everything happened between our parents." But Margaret was not finished. Somehow, through some combination of instinct and a comment Claire had let slip without meaning to, she had pieced together that there was more to the situation than simple family reconciliation. "There's something else going on, isn't there?" Margaret said, her voice dropping into something colder and more dangerous. "Something between you and Daniel. I can hear it in your voice, Claire. Tell me I'm wrong." Claire had hesitated too long, and that hesitation had been answer enough. "My God," Margaret said, her voice rising now, sharp with genuine distress. "You've inserted yourself into my daughter's family, taken her children's affection, and now you're taking her husband too? Do you have any idea how that sounds? How disrespectful that is to her memory?" The call had ended badly, Margaret hanging up before Claire could fully explain, before she could make her aunt understand that none of this had been calculated or planned, that grief and circumstance had led her here, in ways neither of them could have predicted. Claire had called Daniel immediately afterward, her voice shaking as she relayed the conversation, and Daniel had driven over to her apartment that same evening, finding her sitting on her couch, eyes red from crying, a box of old family photographs spread out around her, as though she were searching for some kind of reassurance in the faces of relatives who no longer spoke to her. "She's not wrong to be upset," Claire said miserably, when Daniel sat down beside her. "From the outside, this does look strange, doesn't it? I took a job caring for my dead cousin's children, and now I'm involved with her husband. If someone described that situation to me without any context, I would probably think the worst too." "You know that's not what this is," Daniel said firmly, taking her hand in his, "and deep down, I think Margaret probably knows it too. She's grieving, Claire. She lost her daughter, and now she's hearing about all of this secondhand, without any of the context that would help her understand it properly. That would be hard for anyone to process calmly." "What if she's right, though?" Claire asked, her voice small and uncertain in a way Daniel had not heard from her before. "What if I did take advantage of the situation, even without meaning to? What if the children love me partly because I remind them of their mother, and what if that's not fair to them, or to Laura?" "Claire, look at me," Daniel said, turning to face her fully. "The children love you because of who you are, not because of who you're related to. Sam and Mia didn't know about your connection to Laura until very recently, and it hasn't changed how they feel about you at all. And as for me, I care about you because of the person you've shown yourself to be every single day since you walked through my front door, not because of any connection to my late wife." Margaret's anger is understandable, but it doesn't make her right about the situation itself. Claire wiped her eyes, some of the tension in her shoulders easing slightly at his words, though the worry did not disappear entirely. "I don't want to cause a rift in your family, or reopen old wounds in mine, she said. The children have been through enough loss already. I don't want them caught in the middle of some new family conflict, especially one involving me. Then we'll fix it, Daniel said, with a determination that surprised even himself. Together, we'll give Margaret time to process the shock, and then we'll go see her in person, both of us, and we'll explain everything properly, without any of it coming out sideways over the phone. She deserves that much, and honestly, so does Laura's memory. Claire looked at him for a long moment, something like gratitude and disbelief mixing in her expression, as though she had not expected him to stand so firmly beside her through this particular complication. You would really do that? Go with me to see her, even knowing how angry she is? Claire, Daniel said gently, reaching up to brush a strand of hair back from her face. I'm not going anywhere. Not from you, and not from this. We've both had enough people disappear from our lives without warning. I don't intend to be one more person who does that to you. The words settled something deep and anxious inside Claire's chest, and for the first time since the difficult phone call, she allowed herself to lean into him, resting her head against his shoulder, as the last of the evening light faded outside her apartment window. Whatever difficulties lay ahead with Margaret, whatever old wounds still needed healing within the fractured branches of their family, they would face them together, and that, Claire realized, made all the difference in the world. They drove to Margaret's house the following Saturday, leaving the children with a trusted neighbor for the afternoon, both of them quiet during the hour-long drive, rehearsing in their heads what they might say. Margaret lived in the same small town where Claire and Laura had spent their childhood summers, a modest house with a wide front porch and a garden that Daniel imagined Laura must have played in as a little girl, running barefoot through grass her mother had probably scolded her for ruining. Margaret answered the door with visible reluctance, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, her eyes moving between Claire and Daniel, with an expression that was equal parts wariness and old, unhealed grief. She did not invite them in immediately, standing in the doorway for a long, tense moment, before finally stepping aside. You have 10 minutes, she said, her voice clipped. Say what you came to say. They sat in her small living room, surrounded by photographs of Laura at every age, school portraits and graduation photos, and wedding pictures Daniel recognized from his own home. An entire wall, dedicated to a daughter, Margaret had lost far too soon. Claire's eyes filled with tears, almost immediately upon seeing them, and Daniel reached over instinctively to take her hand. Aunt Margaret, Claire began, her voice trembling but steady, I know how this looks from the outside, and I understand why you're angry, but I need you to know that none of this happened the way it might seem. I didn't go looking for Daniel, or for a way into Laura's family. I found out about her death, and it broke my heart, more than I think I even let myself admit at the time. I took the nanny position because I wanted to feel close to her again, in whatever small way I still could, through the children she left behind. Margaret's jaw tightened, but she did not interrupt, and Claire took that as permission to continue. I never expected to fall in love with any of it, Claire said, her voice growing quieter. Not with Sam and Mia's laughter filling up a house that used to be so heavy with sadness. And not with Daniel. It happened slowly, over weeks of simply being present, simply showing up every day for a family that needed someone steady. I know it's complicated, and I know it might feel like a betrayal of Laura's memory, but I promise you, it has never felt that way to me. If anything, being with this family has made me feel closer to her than I have in years. Margaret's composure cracked slightly, her eyes glistening with tears she clearly did not want to shed in front of them. I lost my daughter, she said, her voice breaking. And I lost you too, all those years ago, because of a stupid argument over a house that none of us even live in anymore. I've spent so many nights wondering what it would have been like if Laura had grown up with her cousin close by, if the two of you had stayed as close as you were as children. And now you're telling me that somehow, through all of this loss, you found your way back into her life anyway, just too late for either of us to actually be part of it together. It's not too late, Claire said softly, moving to sit beside her aunt on the small couch, taking her weathered hand gently in her own. You could be part of Sam and Mia's lives now, Aunt Margaret. They're your grandchildren. They deserve to know you, and I think you deserve to know them too. I'm not trying to replace anyone. I'm trying to build something new out of everything that's been lost, for all of our sakes. Margaret was quiet for a long moment, staring down at their joined hands. decades of old family hurt visibly warring with the fresh grief of losing her daughter, and the unexpected hope of reconnecting with grandchildren she had been kept from, for reasons that suddenly felt small and pointless in the face of everything else. "Tell me about them," Margaret finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Tell me about Sam and Mia. What are they like?" Daniel spoke for the first time since they had arrived, his voice warm with obvious pride as he described his children, Sam's quiet intelligence and dry sense of humor, Mia's boundless energy, and her habit of narrating everything she did, as though providing commentary for an invisible audience. He described how much they had struggled after Laura's death, how much lighter and happier they had become since Claire arrived in their lives, and how, more recently, they had started asking questions about their mother's side of the family, curious about relatives they barely remembered. By the time he finished, Margaret was crying openly, no longer trying to hide it, and Claire wrapped her arms around her aunt in a hug that seemed to release years of accumulated grief and distance all at once. "I would like to meet them," Margaret said finally, wiping her eyes with a tissue Daniel handed her. "If that's all right with you, Daniel. I know I have no right to simply expect that after everything, but I would very much like to know my grandchildren." "They would love that," Daniel said sincerely. "They've been asking about their mother's family for a while now. I think it would mean a great deal to them, and to me, honestly, to have you in their lives." The conversation that followed was gentler, easier, old family stories shared, and small pieces of understanding traded back and forth, as the afternoon light shifted across Margaret's living room. Before they left, Margaret pulled Claire aside for one final moment, her hand resting gently on her niece's shoulder. "Laura would be happy about this," she said quietly. "I think I've known that since the moment you walked through my door. Even though it took me a while to admit it to myself, she always did believe in second chances more than the rest of us. I'm sorry it took me so long to remember that about her." Claire hugged her aunt tightly one more time before they left, and as they drove home together in the fading evening light, something in the car felt different, lighter, as though an old, heavy weight had finally been set down after being carried for far too many years. The road ahead still held uncertainties, questions about how to properly introduce this new chapter to the children, decisions about how quickly or slowly to move forward with their own relationship, but for the first time, none of those uncertainties felt frightening. They simply felt like the next part of a story that was, against every early expectation, turning out far better than either of them could have imagined. Margaret's first visit to the Hartley house took place 2 weeks later, on a bright Saturday morning that Daniel had cleared of every other obligation, wanting nothing to distract from what he knew would be an important, delicate afternoon. Claire had spent the morning nervously rearranging flowers in the living room, and even Sam, usually so reserved about expressing excitement, had asked no fewer than 6 times whether their grandmother liked chocolate chip cookies, apparently determined to make a good impression through baked goods alone. Margaret arrived carrying a small wrapped gift for each child, simple things, a book for Sam and a stuffed rabbit for Mia, along with a hesitant, nervous smile that mirrored the anxiety visible on every other face in the room. Daniel made the introductions carefully, watching his children's faces for any sign of confusion or discomfort, but what he saw instead was open, uncomplicated curiosity. "You're my mommy's mommy?" Mia asked, tilting her head as she studied Margaret with the frank assessment only small children seem capable of. "I am," Margaret said, kneeling down slightly to meet Mia's eye level, her voice thick with emotion she was visibly trying to control. "I'm your grandmother. I should have come to see you a long time ago, and I'm very sorry that I didn't." "That's okay," Mia said simply, with the easy forgiveness of a 6-year-old. "Do you want to see my room? I have a drawing of my mommy that Claire helped me make." Margaret's composure broke slightly at that, tears slipping down her cheeks as she nodded, allowing Mia to take her hand and lead her toward the stairs, chattering the entire way about crayon colors and the specific shade of yellow she had chosen for her mother's hair in the drawing. Sam followed more slowly, his own excitement tempered by the natural reserve of a 9-year-old, but Daniel noticed him lingering close to Margaret throughout the visit, answering her questions thoughtfully, showing her his favorite books, gradually warming into the kind of easy comfort that suggested this new relationship, however delayed, was going to take root and flourish. Daniel and Claire stood together in the kitchen doorway, watching the scene unfold in the living room, Margaret sitting on the floor now, surrounded by children's drawings and old family stories, looking more at peace than either of them had seen since the difficult phone call weeks earlier. "Thank you," Daniel said quietly, wrapping an arm around Claire's waist, "for pushing through all of this, even when it would have been easier to simply let the distance stay where it was. I couldn't have done it without you standing beside me," Claire said, leaning into him. "Any of it, not the conversation with Margaret, and not the months before that either. You gave me a chance I didn't necessarily deserve, and I'm not sure I'll ever be able to properly thank you for that. You've thanked me every single day," Daniel said, turning to face her fully. "Every time I come home and find this house full of laughter instead of silence, every time the kids fall asleep without asking if I'm going anywhere. You brought all of that back into our lives, Claire, and I don't think I can ever fully explain what that's meant to me." Margaret's visits continued over the following weeks, becoming a regular fixture in the household's routine, a standing Saturday tradition that the children began looking forward to with genuine excitement. Slowly, carefully, the fractured pieces of Laura's extended family began knitting back together, old wounds finally allowed to heal now that the stubborn pride that had kept them apart for so many years had finally given way to something more important. One evening, several weeks into this new normal, after Margaret had left following a particularly warm afternoon spent teaching Mia how to press flowers between the pages of an old book, Daniel found Claire sitting alone on the back porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in soft shades of orange and pink. "Can I ask you something?" he said, settling into the chair beside her. "Anything," Claire said, turning to smile at him. "Do you think Laura would be happy about all of this?" he asked. "Not just Margaret coming back into our lives, but everything. Us, the way things have changed." Claire considered the question seriously before answering, her eyes drifting back toward the fading light on the horizon. "I think," she said slowly, "that Laura always believed love was something that should be allowed to grow wherever it found room to grow, even in unexpected places, even after loss. I think she would be sad, of course, that she isn't here to see any of it. But I also think she would be genuinely happy, Daniel. Happy that her children are loved and cared for. Happy that her mother found her way back into the family. And happy, I hope, that the people she loved most in the world found a way to keep building a life together, even after she was gone." Daniel reached over and took her hand, threading their fingers together, as the last light of the day faded into evening. "I think you're right," he said softly. "I think she would be happy. I know I am." They sat together in comfortable silence, as the stars began to appear overhead, the sounds of the children's laughter drifting faintly from inside the house, a family slowly, carefully, rebuilding itself out of grief and secrets and second chances, stronger and more complete than either of them could have imagined when Claire Dawson had first stepped through their front door months earlier, carrying far more than the small suitcase in her hand. A full year passed, marked not by dramatic turning points, but by the quiet, steady accumulation of ordinary happy days, the kind of days Daniel had once feared he would never have again. Claire had long since stopped working as the children's nanny in any official sense, though she remained just as involved in their daily lives as she had always been, her role in the household having shifted naturally into something that no longer needed a job title to define it. The wedding took place on a warm afternoon in early autumn, small and intimate, held in the backyard of the very house where this entire story had begun. Margaret sat in the front row, dressed in soft blue, dabbing at her eyes throughout the ceremony, with a tissue she had clearly brought prepared for exactly this purpose. Nathaniel stood beside Daniel as his best man, grinning through the entire ceremony, with the satisfied expression of a man who had watched his friend rebuild his life from nothing, and felt genuinely proud to have played even a small part in encouraging it along. Mia, now 7 years old, served as flower girl, taking her responsibilities with a seriousness that made the small gathered crowd laugh warmly as she meticulously scattered flower petals in a perfectly straight line down the aisle. Sam, 10 years old now and considerably more confident than the guarded boy who had once kept his distance from every new adult in his life, stood proudly beside his father, holding the rings with careful, deliberate focus, determined not to let anyone down on such an important day. When Claire walked down the aisle, dressed simply and beautifully in a gown the color of soft ivory, Daniel felt the same tightness in his chest he had felt on that first rainy morning when she had stood nervously on his porch with a small suitcase and a secret she had not yet found the courage to share. But where that tightness had once been fear and exhaustion and grief, it was now something entirely different, full and warm and certain, in a way he had not expected to feel again after Laura's death. The ceremony was simple, the vows honest and unadorned, both of them speaking not about erasing the past, but about honoring it, while still choosing to build something new upon its foundation. Daniel spoke about the family Laura had given him, and the family Claire had helped him rebuild, acknowledging both loves as real and important, without asking either to diminish the other. Claire spoke about her cousin, about the childhood friendship interrupted too soon, and the unexpected way that friendship had led her, years later, to a family she had come to love with her whole heart. There was a moment, near the end of the ceremony, when the officiant asked if anyone wished to say a few words in memory of those who could not be present, and Margaret stood, her voice steady despite the tears in her eyes, and spoke briefly about her daughter, about how proud Laura would have been to see her children so loved, so happy, so completely at peace. She spoke about second chances, about the strange and unexpected ways that grief sometimes leads people back to exactly where they need to be, even when the path there makes no sense at the time. After the ceremony, as the small gathering moved into the backyard for the reception, string lights glowing warmly overhead as the evening settled in, Daniel found a quiet moment to pull Claire aside, away from the celebration, just the two of them standing together near the garden Mia had helped plant 2 summers earlier, now grown full and thriving. "Do you remember," Daniel said, "that first morning, when you stood on my porch, and I barely even looked at you properly, because I was so distracted and overwhelmed?" "I remember," Claire said, smiling at the memory. "You had toast hanging out of your mouth, and your tie was only half tied. I remember thinking you looked like a man who desperately needed help, and I remember hoping I could actually provide it." "You did more than that," Daniel said, reaching up to gently touch her cheek. "You saved us, Claire, all 3 of us. I don't think I fully understood, back then, how much this family needed exactly what you brought into it." "We saved each other," Claire corrected gently. "I was just as lost as you were, in my own way. Grieving a friendship I thought I'd never get to properly say goodbye to, searching for some way to hold on to a piece of Laura that had already slipped through my fingers once before. I didn't just find your family that day, Daniel. I found my way home." Inside the house, through the open kitchen window, they could hear Mia and Sam laughing about something with Margaret, the sound carrying warmly across the evening air, joined by the low, easy conversation of Nathaniel and the other guests gathered for the celebration. It was the sound of a house that had once been heavy with silence, now filled instead with the ordinary, precious noise of a family that had been broken and had found its way, slowly and honestly, back to wholeness. Daniel took Claire's hand and led her back toward the party, back toward their children, and the family they had built together out of grief and secrets and second chances. And as they walked, he found himself thinking not of everything that had been lost, but of everything that had finally, unexpectedly, been found. The nanny he had hired in a moment of pure desperation had turned out to be so much more than help around the house. She had turned out to be exactly who he and his children needed all along, the missing piece that made their broken family whole again. And as the stars began to appear over the backyard, where their new life together was just beginning, Daniel understood, with complete certainty, that some of the best things in life arrive not through careful planning, but through the quiet, unexpected grace of circumstances we never could have predicted, waiting patiently on our doorstep until we are finally ready to let them in.